Hi, good day, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us on our conversation today with Jack Puller from ESG. Our topic today is going to be around why consistent identities and policies are needed in a multi-cloud world. And you're probably wondering, what do we mean by that? And that's the point of our conversation today. So we're going to have a good conversation as we get through this. I'd like to do a couple of quick introductions on who we are. I'm Mark Callahan. I'm the head of product marketing here at Strata Identity. And with me today, I've got Jack from Enterprise Strategy Group, who's a senior analyst on the IAM and data research side of things. I'd love to get started here. Jack, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to ESG?
Sure. I'm an industry analyst covering identity and access management and data security. Been with ESG about 10 years now, covering various different aspects, mostly focused on cybersecurity. And now, as I said, focusing exclusively on identity and data security. My formative years were spent as an engineer doing hardware and software development in low-level enterprise IT space, covering storage, networking, 3D graphics, multiprocessor chipsets, and security products. And so through my career as an engineer, then becoming a marketer, became an analyst with ESG.
And awesome. Well, definitely covered a lot of ground during that time, and,
Yep.
and as you and I were talking just before the conversation at Strata, our focus is around identity orchestration. And that's very much this idea of that in a distributed cloud and hybrid world, there's this need for coordination of identities across different platforms. And it's not just identities, it's also policies. But as we thought through this idea of both identity orchestration and policy orchestration, we'd love to get a little bit of your perspective on some of the findings that ESG has seen for the need for this type of coordination across both identities and policies themselves. And would love to hear some of your thoughts about where we are today.
Absolutely. Well, we do a lot of research and demand side research, understanding what the user community is actually doing and needing and wanting with their IT environment. And one of the things we've sort of discovered is we're sort of now in a multi-cloud world. So we used to talk in the last 4 or 5 years, we used to talk about are companies going to go to the cloud? Are they starting to use the cloud and cloud services? And we're way beyond that as far as a conversation, right? It's now not only do companies use cloud products and cloud services, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, but they do so almost exclusively these days. So if we look at the data we have, our data says that most organizations currently use public cloud services. And, we've done the research that says 95%. I actually think that's underreported. The last company I talked to that didn't have any cloud products was a small sheet metal fabrication company in Santa Clara, California. And they had about 10 people, and they were running off of an accounting system that was last updated in like 1993. And they, ancient computers that barely run. And they eventually had to move their email system to Google Mail, right? So then they become a cloud user. So pretty much everybody uses the cloud. Our data says that almost half of organizations have not only used the cloud, but are really cloud first companies, which means that anytime they decide that they're going to do something new, their preference is to do cloud-based application service. And only if they can't make it work in the cloud will they do something on premises.
Sure, take advantage of the resources and the benefits of these cloud available services, because they're here now and there's no reason to go back to a traditional IDP or identity platform.
Exactly. And then, and we all know there's lots of different benefits, and we're not going to talk about really why people choose the cloud, but just understand that not only do they choose the cloud, but particularly for the infrastructure as a service users, the people who are using, say, Amazon S3 services or Google Compute or the database services that Amazon and Google and Microsoft have, 80+% of those companies use multiple cloud service providers, right? And they do so for a variety of reasons, which we can look at. But one of the other things that we're looking at is not only just what they're, that they use the cloud, but what are they doing with the cloud, right? So when we talk to companies today, about 40% of them have apps running on premises, 32% their apps are in the cloud, and roughly 30% have internally developed but still cloud hosted. So more than half of their applications are running in the cloud, and these are their business critical applications. 2 years from now, they predict that they're going to have more of their on-premises infrastructure moving into SaaS apps. And it's a small shift, right? Going from 32 to 35% of SaaS apps. And the reason is these things are difficult and they just take time to move to the cloud. But the COVID pandemic, we've noticed, has accelerated people's efforts to move to the cloud because of work from home, and it's easier to get people to access stuff when they're SaaS apps than when they're internally hosted on-premises apps. And when we talk to companies and say, okay, now we talk 2 years, 24 months out, when we say, okay, what's going to happen in 5 years, right? Where are you going? Well, most of their on-premises applications are going to move to public cloud services, right? Either they're potential or strong candidates to move to public cloud. There's going to be a small portion that aren't going to move for a variety of reasons, mostly because they're ancient, crusty legacy apps, like the sheet metal guy I was talking about.
Sure.
But and the cost of refactoring or moving that application to the cloud is much more than the benefits you get from moving that. So there's some that just won't move, but the majority are going to move to the cloud. Right.
So as we think about it, it's probably fair to say that while we're saying that there's certainly this multi-cloud world, and we're continuing to become even further multi-cloud, that there's always going to be this element of a hybrid world as well, where there are going to be on-prem resources and applications that either need identities supported, or perhaps identity services mapped to them, like passwordless or something, to protect those, since they simply aren't candidates to go to the cloud.
Yes, that's correct. So sometimes you'll have companies will put a front end wrapper for, if you have this ancient crusty application, you still need to protect it. You still need to understand what's going on. So you'll have some way to do an MFA or something in front of that application to ensure that only the people who are supposed to have access to it get access to it.
Sure.
Right. So, when we look at just, that infrastructure section, right, where are people putting their, using infrastructure as a service? More than half of the companies we talk to say that they use 3 or more cloud service providers, right? More than 2, right? So this is sort of the multi-cloud part of it. Is companies choose to use Amazon, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, as well as IBM, as well as Oracle, as well as HP, and these others. They do it for a couple of reasons. One vendor might have a feature they need for one particular application. They might get better costs on one versus another, or they want to make sure that if one goes down, they need reliability. If one service goes down, they can still use the other service. And while these things don't go down a lot, we have seen instances where there have been major outages for one reason or another with an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft for one reason or another, right? So again, what we say is, companies tell us that half of them say they have one that's a primary and one that's for something very specific, a discrete use, and half of the companies say that it's a strategic decision to have multiple cloud service providers.
It's one of the things that we've heard at Strata as we work with our customers, and is that oftentimes there's this 50-50, I think, that you all have certainly seen here. We've also heard this thing of there's both deliberate and unintentional cloud adoption, where we see certain departments, for whatever reason, choose a certain cloud service because it's appropriate to that department, and then all of a sudden it becomes mission critical, and the IT teams are required then to support an additional cloud. So the intentionality is also interesting.
Absolutely, which is part of why I said that first stat where we said 95% of companies use cloud. That's why I think that's undercounted, because there's what we call shadow IT. There's always somebody doing something that you don't know about that's in the cloud, because it's quick and easy and they can, or because you hire somebody who did a project in a cloud. you might be a Google shop, but you hire somebody who did something in Amazon. And so when that person comes on board, they're like, hey, it'll take me 5 minutes to set this thing up, and we're up and running on Amazon, and now we're multi-cloud. We didn't plan it, but now we're here.
And in glazing through that 5 minutes, they've also set up a bespoke identity system that is unique to that particular platform, glossing over how easy it is to do so. But suddenly we've got these different identity stores that come with that too.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Well, in addition to identity, how about data?
Yeah.
A little bit about sensitive data.
So, right. So the key here is there's a ton of data scattered throughout. And in a multi-cloud world, what happens is we've shifted from having a single storage silo or a couple of storage silos, even in an on-premises storage environment, to multiple storage silos scattered throughout the multi-cloud world, right? So I can get the keyboard correctly. Here's what we know about cloud resident sensitive data, the sensitive data that's in the cloud. So companies tell us today that a third of the companies have their clouds have cloud resident sensitive data, right? So the data in the cloud that they have is sensitive. It's sitting there. They know it's there. About a third of the companies have data there, right? And a third of their data is in the cloud. In 24 months, it's going to shift to 2/3 of the companies are actually going to have 2/3 of their sensitive data in the cloud. So we're going to see a massive shift to have more and more sensitive data in the cloud, less and less sensitive data on premises, but it's still going to be on premises. So again, like the multi-cloud world where it's really multi-cloud hybrid, it's the same thing here. We have data scattered all over.
Right? Oh, right. Sure.
And with silos of data, you have data in, you might have data in an S3 bucket. You might have data in a SaaS application like your HR application. You might have data in Salesforce, right? An application. And you're going to have your internal databases that are running maybe, something internal that's going to be, and of course your file storage that's local to your on-premises data storage. Mm-hmm. So you've got this data scattered all over the place, right? That data needs to be protected. So what we know is that today, a third of the companies know they've lost cloud resident data. Now, we asked this question 2 years ago in 2020, and only 20%, less than 20% knew they lost cloud resident data. So we're now seeing more data in the cloud means more risk for losing that data. Mm-hmm. What's even scarier is a third, almost 30%, 28% don't know they've lost data, but think they've lost sensitive data that's in the cloud.
I get heartburn just reading that statistic. I'm just thinking about it. It's the fear of what you don't know. It truly is like, if you don't understand what the environment looks like, how can you know what you've lost? Right.
And part of that comes in, and that's what we're going to dig into, this a little bit. But if you don't know where your data is and you don't have the correct access policies and identity policies around that data, anybody can access it and it can go on walkabout and disappear. Mm-hmm. Get exfiltrated from your company. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the big challenges companies face. So when we say, if you lost data or you think you lost data, how did you lose your data? Well, it's your users. So the biggest things people tell us is users are careless with their data. They misclassify sensitive data as not sensitive. Mm-hmm. They have sensitive data that gets on their personal devices or is accessed from remote work from home users now. And they've got over-permissioned roles that have access to the data. Mm-hmm. Those are the top things, right? So this is the users, which really equates to identities, is why companies lose the sensitive data, right? And
exactly.
And it's a big problem. So
and we're hearing, from even like app developers, as they're putting together, we talked about the ease of moving to one of the cloud platforms. As you think about it from a developer's perspective, what we've heard very specifically from companies is that those app developers are more concerned about the functionality of the app than the identities themselves. And so oftentimes it's an open gate as they set up their apps, ensuring that someone else is going to be handling identity. They don't want to be involved with that. And so speaking to those points you just had.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the dirty little secret of app development. As I said, my background is in engineering, and developers are sort of judged by and compensated for functionality, completing functionality, getting the product up and running and working. So the dirty little secret is that security of any form, particularly identity security, is an afterthought for app developers.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so we need multiple ways, and the common phraseology we use is a belt and suspenders approach to securing things, right? Multiple ways of securing it, also known as defense in depth, having multiple layers of security. So what we know is when you have sensitive data in the cloud, it becomes a target for attackers, right? So we know users are how we lost the data, but sort of why did we lose the data? 3/4 of organizations report that they've had an attack and they've lost data, right? They've either had a security incident or an attack, and that's why they're losing their data. So what's the result? What is the attacks that they're getting? Well, they've got overly permissioned cloud services and applications. They have somebody who's got a targeted attack that's trying to penetrate their organization. They've got a misuse of a privileged account or compromised user credentials, right? So these are all in one form or another identity-related attacks. Those are the prime ways that people get attacked, right? So your software vulnerability is in there, but it's a little bit less. It ranks just a little bit less. So when people are concerned about software vulnerabilities, right, or configuration vulnerabilities, that's not as important in terms of the attack chain. What people are actually doing is the primary attack chain is through an identity. And that's actually, for the biggest attack vector these days, is ransomware. Ransomware almost always starts through an identity-related attack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And almost a commercial for zero trust posture here, as we think about going from this open gate and open door that developers often leave open for everybody to, okay, the gate's open. How do we quickly control it? And it's cutting off access to all and selectively allowing. But then we start looking at the identity silos that we discussed, and we looked at the application and data silos.
Right.
How do you go about that with all these different vendors, right?
Right. Well, and the key for, this is why zero trust is so powerful, but the key for zero trust is you can't decide if somebody is authorized to access something until you know who they are and you've authenticated them, right? So zero trust, the fundamental atomic unit of zero trust is an identity. You must have an identity before you can move to zero trust.
Yeah, makes sense.
So, and that sort of gets to, the next topic we want to talk about is sort of how do we access our sensitive data, right? So what we know when we talk to these companies is that 82%, which is a huge number, report that their full-time employees have access to sensitive data. So it's really a free-for-all. I mean, it's just about anybody can look at it. The fact that you have access to it doesn't mean you should have access to it, right? And this is so wrapped up in that concept of zero trust is another very important concept, which is the principle of least privileged access, right? We should give our employees access to only that which they need to complete their job and no more, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't need this to do your job, then you shouldn't have access to it. And so you see now employees are the big stick out here that sort of everybody thinks about. But we also know that all of these other groups, business partners, supply chain partners, contractors, customers, right? These other types of people have access to your company's sensitive data.
Mm-hmm.
Should they? The answer is almost always no. They should have access to a limited amount. So
if you've given them access one time, should they have access the second time? Or what other factors, could put them at risk, even in the course of an existing session? Are all of a sudden things hijacked along the way? But yes, I mean, it just seems, again, this open door scenario that from a visibility perspective, if you don't know where the door is open, how do you do this?
Right. So understanding, again, this goes back to in a hybrid multi-cloud world where we're using SaaS apps, we're using infrastructure, we're using PaaS. we have all these different types of people who need to access data. Do we know who they are? Right? Have we authenticated them? Have we authorized them to access the data? Do they have the correct permissions? Do they have over permission accounts? Should they be accessing the data? What's our policies for it? Do we have policies around, what do we do when data gets exposed? What do we do about personally identifiable information, social security numbers, or those types of things? So just the companies, if you have a free-for-all here and everybody has access to everything, clearly you haven't set up your policies and defined policies to understand who's supposed to access what.
Absolutely, absolutely, and not introducing too much friction, right? In the same aspect that you're preventing people from doing their jobs, and so there's that balance of the appropriate amount of friction based on the sensitivity of the data or resources against not.
Right. So does a user have the ability, if a user doesn't have permission to access something and they discover they need that in order to do their job, do they have the ability to quickly get access, push a button, call somebody, right? So nowadays what typically happens is an entirely manual process. You call IT and you say, hey, I need to get access to this data piece, whether it's in Salesforce or it's in whatever, and they say, oh, well, I have to go check with the manager and get three sign-offs and 14 steps in order to get approval to give you access. And then we have to go through the manual process of saying, okay, let me update your account to give you access to that. And that could mean in a paid SaaS app, that could mean changing your account type, which may even incur more money.
Yeah.
Right. So, that frictionless part of it is an importance, which is why companies over provision accounts, because they're not necessarily aware of the risks we're talking about. And then they say it's just easier to give people access than deal with somebody complaining that they don't have access and the amount of effort and time it is to change their access.
That's really interesting, because then you think about the scale of that within an organization, that it's not just, this is an app by app and even resource by resource basis within those apps. You're going to be multiplying this by 20, 30, 300, 1,000 applications. And all of a sudden there's a scale problem here, a scary one.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like I said, it's that scale problem is why people provide open access, because it's easier than limiting and dealing with the consequences of limiting access.
Gotcha.
Right. So as we talked about, over permissive roles are common. It's what we call expanding the attack surface. It means that the more data that somebody can get access to, that's more data that can be attacked and exfiltrated. Sorry. Right. So approximately 30% of the companies have somewhere between 30 and 50% of their users have over permissioned accounts and roles. Right. Now, this could be anything from, you have access to data you shouldn't, to you may have super user privileges when you're not an admin, right? Which can be extremely dangerous if somebody can get access to your identity and then they have what we call the keys to the kingdom, right?
That's exactly. Or loss of a device, things where it's controlling, there might be GDPR requirements about who has access to what data based on a geo-specific basis as well. And so it's not just maybe a security risk, but there could be like a regulatory risk in some of this as well, with these overly permissive roles. And
the cost of exposure can be not only the actual cost of exposure if you lose personally identifiable information, but if you're in Europe, you have a GDPR exposure, which can lead the company to fines, right?
Yeah.
If somebody takes that data home on their laptop and then the laptop gets stolen, right? You're not just out a laptop. Even if nothing happens, you have a GDPR exposure. And if you don't report it properly and get notified properly and do all the right regulatory steps, then you're exposing the company to massive fines.
And all this keeps coming back to identity and policy, policy.
So when we look at data loss, a lot of data loss comes from misconfigured cloud services, right? And, you think about it, if you remember the Capital One credit card company that was attacked, right? That was because they had a misconfigured account. They had an admin who left the company and still was, even though she left the company, they never canceled her accounts. She was able to get back in and do stuff. So they had a misconfigured and actually an overly permissioned role, because that role should have, that account should have actually been terminated, but it wasn't when she left the company. And they had a massive exposure, cost them a huge amount of money and a huge amount of customer goodwill. Right. So those who report data loss more likely have discovered a range of misconfigured services, over permission accounts, unencrypted data. Data resident is accessible to more users than intended, another form of over-permissioned accounts. And the other one is a lack of MFA, multi-factor authentication. All right. So we know a lot about, protecting accounts, and MFA, multi-factor authentication, is key. Passwords are weak and are easy to break for a variety of different reasons. Traditional multi-factor authentication, where you use a second factor that gets sent to you by an SMS code on your text to your phone, that's actually also not very secure. The bad guys have figured out ways to either social engineer you into getting that data, or actually getting that because it's unencrypted and easily accessible communication.
It's in the open, and man in the middle.
Open, it's man in the middle, plus you can spoof it. There's a lot of different ways. So there's a lot of new technology, which are all sort of under the rubric of passwordless authentication, that will really help.
You mentioned something at the beginning that I was going to call back on here, which was around those legacy applications, of being able to protect them. There are certain applications that are never going to be not on-prem, but in the same breath, it's like, how do you protect those? And that's, one of the things that on Strata that we found that's incredibly valuable to our customers, is that we have abstracted the identities and policies away from the applications themselves, so that you can, just as you pointed out, layer on that protection in front of a legacy app that might not otherwise be able to accept it, and be able to do it without rewriting the app. And that's where, we've seen this incredible need, because otherwise you're leaving all of, this huge percentage of your hybrid environment unprotected.
And that's a key, because the only other way to protect those types of applications are really to lock them down almost to the point where they're not usable, right? If you restrict all the accounts to not having really access to the sensitive data, then those applications really, those internally developed, internally accessible applications lose their utility for the organization.
Yes.
So, people think about, well, how do I put a firewall around it? But firewalls really aren't sufficient anymore, and VPNs aren't sufficient anymore because we have so many people doing work from home. And is the authentication authorization you get through the firewall, is that enough? Or, well, that authenticates the person doing the access, but doesn't authorize them to get access to the appropriate amount of data. They should, right? So you're not able, just because you have a firewall or using zero trust as your VPN or zero trust version of a VPN for remote access, doesn't mean you're giving somebody the right level of access to the data on this internally hosted application. That may be old and crusty and doesn't really have a way of really limiting people's access. It may basically say there's exactly one level of access, which is all, because it's a very old application and we didn't think about how we do that, right? So having some other way to authenticate and authorize people to do something with the app is very important.
Gotcha.
Otherwise, you're at risk of getting compromised in one form or another. All right. So when we look at what are the identity challenges people have when they want to implement identity and access management solutions to solve some of these problems, right? So the biggest issue people have that's really, really important is maintaining security consistency, right? Particularly when you have this hybrid multi-cloud world and you need to go across both your own internal on-premises environment and multiple cloud and SaaS providers, right? So every provider has, every IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS provider has their own view of what an identity is, has their own view of what the policies that you can put in place are.
Yes.
And you then have to have a consistent security policy that says, this person, say you, Mark, can have access to this type of information, regardless of how you're getting that type of information, whether you're doing it through a SaaS app, an infrastructure-based app, or an on-premises app, right? Still need to be able to say that because you're a marketing guy, you shouldn't have access to any HR data, regardless of where that HR data is, right? You shouldn't be able to see anybody's payroll, right? So how do you apply that policy? How do you develop that policy and then apply consistency? And that's a big challenge people have, right?
Absolutely. And I even see that the complex IAM combinations make it difficult. As we're thinking through how do you secure applications, resources, and data, oftentimes it's a combination of vendors. It's an identity proofing organization. It's a passwordless company. And there's 5 or 6 different things that need to take place to protect a modern application. And the question comes up, how do you orchestrate what's taking place throughout that session across all of those different vendor solutions to have a quick and frictionless experience? And thankfully, that's, again, another very strong value proposition of what we're doing on the identity orchestration side, is allowing that mix of vendors, or the coexistence of multiple authentication solutions to enable that.
Yep. And that's, and people will say, look at, well, what about SSO, single sign-on? Isn't that what single sign-on is doing? And what single sign-on is really doing is it's touching on a very small part of that problem. It's removing friction for the user and providing a consistent way of authenticating a user, saying this user is who they claim to be, is who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it doesn't give you that authorization. It's the authentication portion. It doesn't help you maintain that security policy across your environment. It doesn't help you set the policy either. It's only a very small piece of the challenge people are facing, right? The other part of this is when you don't have security, when you don't have this security consistency across your environment, then maintaining compliance with all your regulations and laws becomes very, very difficult. Right?
Yes.
If you can't define who is and who is not supposed to have access, then you can't maintain compliance with either things like HIPAA, the health insurance privacy policy regulations, or the security SOC 2 compliance, or any one of the other regulations, right? All of those assume you have the ability to define who has access to information and who doesn't, and what information they're allowed access to, and that you can and do apply that correctly. So if your challenge is you can't do that consistently and correctly, then you can't meet any regulatory, and you will fail audits consistently. I mean, the consistency will move to failing your audits and not meeting your regulatory environments rather than to your security environment. All right. So then, you look at some of the other challenges companies have is that they don't have the ability to maintain a single identity. They don't have visibility. Updating roles and privileges are hard, right? So there's a lot of identity challenges that fundamentally come down to the fact that we're in this multi-cloud hybrid world. Every single platform we deal with, whether it's on-premises, it's a SaaS app, it's PaaS environment, or it's an IaaS, an infrastructure environment where we're developing our own apps on it. All of these different environments have their own concept of what an identity is. They have their own concept of security policies, authorization, and access associated with identities. And that makes it extremely difficult to manage your identity platform, to manage your identities, to set policies, to have a consistent view, to have a single identity for people across the environment. Right. And sort of one of the other keys, and there's a small company, small portion of our respondents talk about this, but it's an important part, is the current directory service doesn't provide native support for all the cloud services, right? So if you try to use a single directory service, particularly if you're using something that's traditional and on-premises based, having that on-premises directory service map to the cloud can become very difficult. So companies that are the older companies that have this big footprint, that have use a Microsoft Active Directory or some other on-premises directory store, it can be a challenge for them to map that into all the new cloud stuff that's happening. Right. So what are organizations looking for? They need a unified strategy, right? We need consistency. We need to have tools that really help us manage this huge multi-cloud, hybrid cloud world, the identities in this world, right? And that's really what companies are looking for, right? So one of the keys that companies are telling us is that identities used to be managed basically by the app or infrastructure owner. So you would have a SaaS app, say Salesforce, and the identities involved in Salesforce would be managed and owned by whoever was managing the Salesforce app. And that would typically be a different person or a different group of people than who are managing your on-premises identities, and would be
Yes.
still another group of people who are managing your infrastructure identities. And you might actually have a different group of people managing your AWS environment and therefore AWS identities from your S3, from your Google identities or your Microsoft Azure identities.
Mm-hmm.
So companies now are saying, look, we're going to shift these teams to become a unified IAM team. So we're going to have one team that's really going to start owning identities throughout our IT footprint, regardless of where it is. That team is going to centralize and unify identity and access management, and therefore policy management, right? So now we've gotten step one is to get the right people doing the work,
Right.
right? That's sort of step one, right? Step two is to say, how do we get to a unified view of identities? And that is, we want to go to cloud-based identities and a cloud identity store of some form or another. So a majority are looking at moving to a cloud-based directory service. They either are or are going to move to in the near future, in the next 12 to 24 months. And that's because having a cloud-based identity store allows them to have a more unified management environment, as well as have identities that spread throughout that footprint that's hybrid, multi-cloud, on-premises, in various different clouds, all at the same time.
Makes sense.
Right. Right. But there's a big challenge there. Identity information is really your crown jewels. As we said, this is where ransomware attacks occurs through identity attack. This is where most of your sensitive data attacks occur in the cloud setting, right? That we've talked about. And users are they users or are they losers because they lose data, right? And it's all related to your identity. So some companies are hesitant to move to cloud resident and cloud-based identity stores because they perceive it might be a security concern, right? So there's this sort of a dilemma of weighing the value of a cloud-based identity store versus we have all of our stuff that's cloud accessible that somebody can then attack.
Right.
This right. People are doing this balancing act right now. Now, they're eventually going to realize that the value of having a cloud-based solution and having that extend and the ability to do our orchestration and policies and get much more consistency across their IT environment far outweighs any risks they have from having it cloud-based versus on-premises.
Well, and there's a couple of factors here that we saw, the requiring support for on-prem applications and migrating is too difficult. Again, it's that scale problem, because what happens in modernization and in migrating those apps is refactoring is required of every single app, and you have to have access to the owners of those applications to make the controls and get political buy-in. And so all of a sudden you start seeing that there's not a centralized way to solve this distributed challenge. And again, another very strong premise of why identity orchestration is so critical in helping to facilitate these migrations and do it in a way where you don't have to rewrite the applications. You don't have to maintain custom code. As you abstract the identities out, you're able to do it all at this identity fabric abstraction layer, and it counters a lot of these issues, right? And so this is, yes, very much what we're hearing as well.
Yep. And so that's where we get to sort of the last data point we have is companies are telling us that they want to build identity access management that can be used across their entire environment. It's the number one thing that they want, right? Second thing they want is multi-factor authentication, because that's the biggest security hole to exploiting identities is through passwords, right? But Before you even get to that, you want to be able to manage your entire identity footprint across your environment. And you'd really ideally like to manage it from one single place and be able to then get to that security consistency we're talking about, where you have the ability to define policies and you have the ability to set them and have that apply throughout your IT environment, regardless of where your apps are and your data is.
That's exactly, because you can have an HR approach to centralizing IAM in your organization, which you all are certainly finding. But then it's like, what's the software approach to solving this distributed problem? And harkening back to the premise of that both identity and policy orchestration are really honestly critical to meet the overall challenge that we're seeing as shown by the data.
Yep. So that's pretty much where that's sort of the story we tell to help people understand what's the data. This is research we've done. There's a story that comes from the data that says we're in this multi-cloud world. We have this challenge of setting consistent policies, getting the whole identity challenge we've been talking about. And I think that's where Strata comes to play.
That's great. And I think it's unfortunate that we can't see the audience, because sometimes it's fun to see the head nodding where people are, that's me, you're speaking to me. As our audience is doing that head nodding, there's some resources that we've made available at the end of this session. And first and foremost, Jack, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I love talking with you about this and honestly seeing the data that speaks to what we've seen ourselves here. But as you're thinking through these challenges, this is for our audience. We have a white paper here around identity orchestration that speaks to that need and how this can be solved and done with the systems and identity solutions that you already have in place, as well as future-proofing what you are looking to add down the road, be it passwordless or identity verification, knowing your customer, lots of things along those lines. And so with that, make sure, my audience here, we want to make sure there's a link on the screen so you can get access to these resources. You can also contact Strata at the information that you have here. I'd like to open it up just to a couple quick questions. I know we're coming up on time, which is great. When we had a good conversation, it means we went long. I think we have time probably for 2 questions from the audience. Do you have a moment for those?
Yep.
All right. First one is a question about zero trust. We mentioned, I guess, early, about halfway through. The question is zero trust architecture possible, or is it always going to be aspirational for companies? Okay, is it pie in the sky, I think is what they're asking here, or is it actually possible?
No, it's actually possible. And, as we talked about, right, think about zero trust as fundamentally switching our philosophy from allow all to deny all, allow very specific users to do very specific things. And that's easy to do if you have identities and consistent identity policies throughout your environment. It's easy to do if you have the ability to authorize and authenticate. And so it's really fundamentally an identity question. The rest of it, once you know who somebody is and what they're trying to get access to and whether they're allowed to or not, the rest of it is simply engineering. And it's not that difficult engineering, right? It's really sort of thinking about a firewall and flipping it the other way around.
Okay. All right. And with just a few minutes left, you and I touched a little bit on remote workforce. There's a question about, it seems that COVID's permanently changed the way that we work. How do we accommodate the remote workers, the devices, and identities? I think that was certainly a data point that we saw in your data, that the remote environment has led to a need for orchestration. But how do we accommodate remote workers, devices, and identities?
Right. Well, so the first thing to understand is that, the world has changed because of the pandemic, but so many companies are telling us they're going permanently to a hybrid workforce with some remote, some on in the office, that we no longer actually ask those questions in our research. We just assume that's sort of and I hate to use the phrase, but that's the new normal, right? Mm-hmm. So then again, it comes down to making sure you know who people are, you authenticate them. It's an identity question, that they're authorized to access the applications and data they want. And then you can do that through a combination of tools that are remote access tools like Zero Trust Network Access, as well as implementing the appropriate Zero Trust type policies in your environment, in your on-premises environment, and in your cloud apps that you implement, right?
Mhm.
So you can either have people access everything through zero trust network access VPN-like solution, or they can, with the appropriate permissions, you can implement that philosophy without doing any additional tools, right? Again, if you have the right, like using Strata to have the right identity orchestration and set the right policies across your environment, and you're able to authenticate people appropriately, then you've got zero trust.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you. I think we ran a little over on time. That's always a good sign. But I love chatting with you today, Jack. For our
Good
audience,
conversation.
some contact info on the screen for follow-up. Do you have a preferred way for folks to reach out, Twitter versus email for you?
Twitter or email works just fine.
Likewise for myself. So we'd love to hear from the audience as well, any additional questions that might have come up. And thanks again for the time, Jack. This was really great.
Thank you. It was fun.
Take care, everybody.